Books that shaped your personal values. Hello. Welcome to I Love Reading, a channel about interesting book-related subreddit topics. If you love our content, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Note: books mentioned throughout this video can be accessed through the links below. Oh, and if you're not a member of Audible, which by far is the biggest audiobooks online store, pause the video, head over to the description box, click on the link provided, and choose any audiobook that will be mentioned, plus 2 other Audible originals from a collection of more than 200,000 audiobooks. Completely for free. Now let's get started. Sometimes, a book leaves me with a lasting impression that I revisit in my mind until it eventually becomes a part of the way I think. It's like lines of code get added to my desktop computer. Does this happen to you too? What concept in a book became part of your own system of values? Here are a few of mine. Near the beginning of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. He gives excellent communication advice. Don't come on too strong. Use phrases that suggest mild diffidence, uncertainty. Such as, "It seems to me that," or "It would appear that," instead of blustery firm statements like, "Certainly it is," or "Anyone can see that," which tend to turn people against you. From Man's Search for Meaning. A friend was walking across a field with me toward the camp when suddenly, we came to a field of green crops. Automatically, I avoided it. But he drew his arm through mine and dragged me through it. I stammered something about not treading down the young crops. He became annoyed, gave me an angry look and shouted, "You don't say. And hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed. Not to mention everything else. And you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats." Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. Nobody wanted to be around this guy, and for good reasons, but no matter how irrational and disagreeable he became in his last years, I made sure my aging father was cared for and safe. Something about this piece of the Count of Monte Cristo never left me. Of all the injustices Edmund was subjected to, he goes into full Inigo Montoya mode because people had neglected his father, who died homeless of starvation while he was imprisoned. "Starvation?" exclaimed the abbé, springing from his seat. "Why, the vilest animals are not suffered to die by such a death as that. The very dogs that wander houseless and homeless in the streets had some pitying hand to cast them a mouthful of bread, and that a man, a Christian, should lie allowed to perish of hunger in the midst of other men, equally Christians with himself, is too horrible for belief. Oh, it is impossible. Utterly impossible." Night by Nobel Peace Prize winner, Elie Wiesel. Although he was put through the most hateful conditions during the Holocaust and losing his entire family, he said he could not hate his abusers because then he would be just like them. Thanks. I put this book on my list this year. It sounds like Elie is similar to that story in Frankel. It is a very short read, maybe 100 pages, be very intense. I taught it every year that I was an English teacher, and almost every student at the end of the year said it was his or her favorite. The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. We tend to think of ourselves as good people because we aren't murdering people or robbing banks, but Lewis shows how the big sins, pride, envy, wrath, can manifest themselves in our day-to-day life, corrupting us and poisoning our relationships with each other. The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. There are a few people who really are bad, and the world seems to be on their side, but if we dig deeper, we can see that most of us are really fighting for the same things. Labyrinths by Jorge Luis Borges. Borges is usually thought of as a pure fantasist, exploring philosophies for their own sake. But if stories like Tlan, Ukber, or Tertius The Garden of Forking Paths and Death and the Compass have a moral, it's an important one. Our intolerance of ambiguity, our obsession with totalizing systems of thought, and our willingness to let such systems do our thinking for us, will lead to our destruction. I love these 3 books. Borges definitely isn't a first name that I picture when thinking about personal ethics, partly because of the reasons you mention, partly because of his politics, but you're definitely right about how illuminating his skepticism is. The way he systematically approaches the world as a text, has shaped my relationship to literature and to thinking. I really appreciate Vonnegut's take on humanism as actually being more inherently moral than organized religions. A religious person is taught to do good deeds so that they get into heaven. It turns the concept of goodness into something that's done primarily out of self-interest. On the other hand, a humanist doesn't believe in heaven but does good deeds just because it's the right thing to do, with no extrinsic reward for doing so. I love Vonnegut so much. My comment history has a lot of Vonnegut throughout. The first one I read about 12 years ago was Slaughterhouse's 5, and it actually threw me into a gloom funk for a couple months. I hadn't been so overshadowed by a book before. From there, I read all of his greats and just about everything else too. My favorite lesser-mentioned Vonnegut book is Galapagos, and his humanism shines through in the commentary of the ghost guy who is always mentioning how our big human brains were too powerful because they had way more capacity than required for survival, so that the extra brainpower was so often dedicated to bad things like lying and cheating, currency speculation causing food shortages and economic crises. Has to be depressing to be smart enough to write parody dystopia sci-fi that comes true in your lifetime. My son got into Vonnegut too. I was a proud papa about that. Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark by Carl Sagan. By far the most important book I've ever read. It taught me how to actually think critically and gave me the tools to evaluate any given claim being made in a reasonable and logical way. The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. That book stayed with me like no others. So many of the reasoning he makes about life and why we choose to live really changed my whole perspective. Would recommend it. It's pretty short too. Thanks. Just added it to my list. I read The Plague in October and liked it, but I got the feeling that I missed out on the best of it because I was listening to it as an audiobook while doing landscaping in my backyard. There's probably a lot in between the lines that I was missing. Another French thinker I absolutely connected with is Montaigne. This month I read his complete essays and was blown away. When I got to the apology for Raymond Sebond, I found myself stopping every other paragraph to copy something into Evernote. The Count of Monte Cristo for me too. I think it's underrated, and the psychology of it is often overlooked due to the swashbuckling adventure aspect. The Count is less than honest with himself about his motivations and is so secure in his own sense of righteousness that he is willing to overlook the effects of his actions faced with their most devastating consequences. I think there's a lesson there for the internet age. I'd like to throw down A Man for All Seasons. Play by Robert Bolt. Which I read in high school and had a profound impact on my view of balancing values with self-preservation. And anytime I feel myself becoming too cynical, I'll grab The Lord of the Rings for a reread. And anytime I feel myself becoming too cynical, I'll grab The Lord of the Rings for a reread. I love this thought. I met a very friendly 50-something guy who read them about once a year. I imagine that they contributed to his good-naturedness. Perfume. The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Susskind. Jesus Christ. That book has stuck with me and is such an unsettling read. I've read it perhaps 10 times and could pick up from any part of that novel and just start reading. It makes me super aware of the smells in my life and my own pheromones and how our smell plays a role in day-to-day interaction. The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I was 8th grade and I just swallowed it. I couldn't stop reading. Hemingway's sentences just float. It comes naturally like drinking a glass of water. I was struck with his philosophy of life. Despite the fact that old man Santiago had a tough life, he just fought on. He never felt sorry for himself, and neither did the author. Same thing here about Frankel's book. That exact same passage. It requires a kind of integrity that is almost heroic, and I doubt I could live up to it in circumstances as extreme as his, but it's at least something I strive for. Also, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. The notion of God is change, the necessity to adapt to change, to anticipate it, shape it, be shaped by it, and the relevance of working together to create a community strong enough to face change and what it can bring is something that has become part of how I interact with other people. Wow, same passage. I'm glad it found you too. I like the description you gave for Parable of the Sower. Just added it to my list, it sounds like a book I'd like. Thanks. Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. I didn't really get this abstract thing, known as globalization, nor did I give it a lot of thought. This book is great about detailing what is happening and the good. And made it obvious to me the dangers of what a lot in America are up against. With a flat world, your American birth certificate means nothing. And you must compete based on merit globally, and no amount of politicians can save you. Not just America, but the nativists of the world are revolting against it. In a way, so are the globalists. They're trying to rein it in, under their control. Neither one will be able to ever do so, though they can make everything harder than it ever need be. Schopenhauer's The World is Will and Representation. Or Will and Idea, if you prefer. And the essay, The Fate of Thomas Paine in Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. I have that Schopenhauer book on my to-read list. There's a quote from him that I really like. It's about why we shouldn't worry too much about what other people think of us. Here it is. Apart from this, what goes on in other people's consciousness is, as such, a matter of indifference to us. And in time we get really indifferent to it when we come to see how superficial and futile are most people's thoughts. How narrow their ideas. How mean their sentiments. How perverse their opinions. And how much of error there is in most of them. When we learn by experience with what depreciation a man will speak of his fellow when he is not obliged to fear him or thinks that what he says will not come to his ears. And if ever we have had an opportunity of seeing how the greatest of men will meet with nothing but slight from half a dozen blockheads, we shall understand that to lay great value upon what other people say is to pay them too much honor. I've added that Russell book to my list, thanks. There you have it. Books that shaped our Books members' personal values. Thank you for watching till the end. Before you leave, do me a huge favor and remember to subscribe to I Love Reading if you have not already. Lastly, press the bell icon to get notified immediately I release new content. See you on the next video.